Good evening. Welcome. Let's get started. You can sit down. Yeah. Good. All right. So my name's Will Galloway. I'm the co-host this evening with Terry Peters, who's going to share some of the speaking duties this evening. I'm going to do all of this stuff that needs to be said, just for things to run smoothly. And Terry's going to do the introduction, and then we'll hear from our speakers tonight. So Terry and I are the co-chairs of the Department of Architectural Science Lecture Committee. And I guess I should say how we're paying for all this. Our lecture series is sponsored by Esri, Thames Valley Brick and Tile, Diamond Architects, the Ontario Association of Architects, and especially this evening's lecture and the exhibition, which you've seen, are supported by the class of 1983. And I thought this is important to remind you of, or at least to point out, because alumni helped make this happen. And eventually, theoretically, all of you or many of you here are going to be alumni. So just keep in mind that, this is sponsored by people just like you. And it sounds like PBS, right? So, keep this in your head, 10 or 20 years from now, pay it forward. This is a privilege. Yeah, 1-800-365. Yeah. Okay, so not completely lost track of where I am. Thank you all very much anyways for the support and making this evening possible. Okay, so brief outline of tonight's event. After I finish talking, Terry's going to introduce the guests, and they're going to speak for about 45 or 50, 60 minutes. And then we will have a question and answer period. And we have lots of time, and I'm going to invite you to keep your questions till after they finish speaking. And when we have the Q&A session, please wait for the microphone to come to you. This is live streamed and it's recorded, and it can be hard to hear without the microphone. So please wait till the microphone comes. Okay, so in terms of what this lecture series is about, if you'll just indulge me briefly, just to remind you. So this is the first lecture of this term. Last term, we had a number of really amazing speakers, and we're starting off with a bang again with really good speakers this year. The theme is, it's basically public space in the city. And we're inviting speakers to come and remind us of the fact that what architecture does and how the city is engaged with as architects and designers is still really up for grabs. And we're still rethinking and reconceptualizing and re-engaging with the city. So that's the general theme for the entire year, and we'll have more speakers later on. And Soka, our speakers this evening, are a really great beginning for this term. So before Terry introduces our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which we are gathered. So Toronto Metropolitan University sits on lands that are now known as Toronto, which have been inhabited for millennia by Indigenous nations and people. It is our tradition, therefore, to begin our meetings with the land acknowledgement, which not only recognizes the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples in our area, but also to take it as a reminder that we are all accountable to these relationships, something that we should be reminded of, I think, quite often. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And these are the best words you can think of, especially in our times. In this spirit, and on behalf of our university, I welcome you all. And so on those fine words, I'm going to pass the mic to Terry.
Thanks, Will. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Some of you hopefully have had a chance to see the exhibition in our gallery space. And for the folks tuning in via live stream, I'm just going to introduce you to our speakers briefly. So the Studio of Contemporary Architecture is an architecture and urban design studio here in the city that focuses on inclusive city building and the creation of beautiful spaces. They've won numerous awards in the past few years, including the just a number of them. The shortlist, which includes the 2023 Professional Prix de Roman Architecture, a traveling grant allowing the studio to explore sites of blood, joy, and community globally, and the 2023 Emerging Architectural Practice Award for the RAIC. So those are two really outstanding awards, and so we're really excited to hear about their practice. So for the sake of brevity, I'll leave it at those two awards, but please check out their website, which highlights all of their work and, of course, their exhibition in the gallery. As mentioned before, Tura is a graduate of our program, the undergraduate program, and his master's degrees in architecture, urbanism, building science were earned at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He's a registered architect in the Netherlands and here in Ontario, and we're very lucky to have him this term as an instructor in the fourth year studio. So that's great. And his partner Shane is a licensed architect in Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. He earned his Bachelor of Science and MArch degrees from McGill University, where he also teaches. And Shane is currently serving as a board member in the CACB. He's leading several projects supporting art, gathering, and joy in marginalized communities. Please give a warm welcome to our guests this evening, Shane and Tura.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. So our presentation tonight is regarding our exhibition of Toronto Imagined, which looks at a speculative future for Toronto. We'll start with a quote by Michael Ondaatje from In the Skin of a Lion. Before the real city could be seen, it had to be imagined. And with that, that novel, which explores the history of and the story that behind the construction of the Prince Edward Viaduct, which, as you may know, is where Bloor Street extends across the Don Valley, connecting to Danforth. That was an incredibly visionary project at the time, as it was built decades in advance of any subway connecting the east and the west banks of the Don Valley. And that foresight and that vision as to what the city could be decades into the future by providing a rail line beneath the roadbed was a very significant element of sort of visioning for the future of the city, which has allowed, like for myself, me to get here within 20 minutes on the subway today.
I'll just add to that. I think for those of you who didn't sort of hear the brief introduction earlier, a lot of our work as a studio, as a practicing studio, has been looking at speculations, largely in Toronto. And the idea, I think, we have missed opportunities or shortcomings in built practice. And I think that's also the value of school and being a student, where you can ask questions and explore ideas that you couldn't in the real world. And that's been a focus of our work. And I think this lecture will be getting into that. And I'll start more on a personal note. Start with me. Yeah, this is me in actually second year studio, which is now fourth year studio, the same day actually that I'm teaching right now. I think around 2005. So I think, yeah, starting with the personal anecdote, it's kind of feels weird to be up here. I think to say, so one of my first memories in the building, and I grew up in the city, but it was always coming downtown. I grew up in St. Jamestown, Yonge and Bloor, then, later more uptown at Bathurst and St. Clair. It was never sort of, downtown was always sort of the Eaton Center, but it's kind of never really going further east. So first time in the pit was, we had an entrance exam. I don't know if they have to do this still. It was a drawing exam. And I felt terrible because it's like this, I don't know, as architects, people always sort of say, oh yeah, you're really great at, you have to be really a great artist and really great like mathematician. And I was like, neither. And I came into the pit, in addition to sending in a portfolio, had to do this entrance exam, this drawing exam of, I think it was these cubes, these geometric shapes, like centered in the front. The lights were all dim, and there was probably another 20 or 30 students here. And I started drawing, and at the end of it, I looked towards like these two young women, probably I guess same age as me, so it was like fresh out of high school or still in high school at the time. And their drawing was immaculate. The way they had the light and the shadows, and I was like, "Oh darn, I'm not going to get in." And it was, I have to say, it was, I guess, yeah, Ryerson at the time. TMU was my first choice, so I applied to U of T and applied to Carleton, and TMU was my first choice. I got into U of T, got into Carleton, and then Ryerson was just the last one. And I was like, "Oh no, I didn't make it because of my my sketch." And sure enough, I was accepted, and here we are today. Yeah. A little Rye inspiration story. So we've broken this lecture into a few parts. Part one, a family story about our city, and it's starting with what we call as Granny's house, which was my grandmother's house, where I currently live with my wife, two kids, a toddler, 1-year-old, and a 3-year-old, and currently have a tenant in our basement. And I'll speak to that. And I think this personal story speaks to some of the challenges and ideas of what Toronto is and a lot of our later projects. This is my grandmother on her front porch, and it's with the newborn baby of a neighbor. And I think what I really like about it is you can't really tell it's Toronto. And I thought this was really interesting, and I'll get into that a bit more. A bit about my grandmother. Came to Canada as a domestic worker in 1965. So that's her standing in the middle, the shorter woman. That there is in Jamaica. And really interesting, I've always sort of knew her as, I think, just as kind of a granny, a woman to kind of be like, "How's school? How's life?" Or here's dinner when you come over. But not really herself as a younger woman. And it wasn't until she was older, needed to go into a long-term care facility, that I began to sort of clean out her house, which the plan was to turn it into a triplex, which essentially it was, though never kind of legally converted into one. But it had 3 kitchens, fire stair at the back. And I think to say sort of part of it was just sort of uncovering a life lived of this woman. The letter on the right there is a letter from her father, so my great grandfather, thanking her for sending money back home to Jamaica. And so I sort of spend this time after work kind of going over, planning to clean the house, but it was this long process, and I'm ending up like spending an evening just reading letters and not actually getting anything done. And kind of uncovering, photos of my mom. I think one was my mother's report card. And I wish as a kid, I knew that my mom got like C's, because that I would have had something on her. But again, seeing sort of a life of family, was the image on the right, not sure if it's family or not, or friends, but it was just this found image. I think another big thing too is, talk to your grandparents before it's too late, or your parents too. But yeah, my grandmother and I was a very kind of eccentric woman. The letter on the right is from the older Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau. I guess as a lot of immigrants to Canada were kind of Trudeau fans. And then the letter, actually the newspaper article there. So that was my grandmother. And a bit of a tangent. I was talking to her, it was a Sunday. I was like, "Hey, Tura, how's it going?" I was like, "Good. How are you?" She was like, "Oh, great. I met the Queen." And I just, when she told me that, I was like, "Oh, sure, Granny." I was like, "What'd you do?" She's like, "Yeah, I just gave her a gift. She was really pleasant. I met Prince Philip. It was really nice." And the conversation just trailed off, not really thinking it was real. It was just, Granny's getting old. And then, but sure enough, next day, front page of the news, this title, "Security No Match for Older Woman." And it was a really interesting article. And it was talking about how like RCMP need to review their security protocol. Like there's a great video of it online. And I think it was like any one of us, we would have been tackled immediately. But because it was an elderly woman, they're kind of like, oh, what do we do? And she made it all the way up. And then, they're commenting like, what was in the bag? And the comments, as comments are, and news articles are great. Like, what if it was a bomb? Like, how could we let this go? But it was a commemorative tea towel. And I think speaking to the stories of one person in a city. So this image is sort of an image I took of cleaning out her house, and it was really a slow process. And by all intents of the word, she was a hoarder, and there was stuff that was junk, but then you had to kind of shake out this like weird romance novel, and you might find a $50 bill. And shout out to my wife, Alex, for helping me in the process. So that happened, and it was kind of a discovery too of what was the meaning of this house, and a challenge in the sense, oh, there's my wife again. A challenge in the sense of what happens to a house where you have all this memories and meaning, but at the same time, there's asbestos. It's, a wood frame, really like 2x4 stick construction home. It's over 100 years old, not insulated, raccoons living in the roof. It was in a rough shape, or to a degree, everything had to go. So it was, I think, a sense of finding the meaning in that circumstance. And I think this diagram kind of gets to, I think, the core of the exploration. And one was, I think, with the middle image, was allowing for the house to just be new, not sort of getting held up in the past. And it's kind of a conceptual idea of creating a void, which was formerly my grandmother's bedroom, and turning that into a back room at the back of the house, which is, currently my bedroom, and allowing that to be an empty space and not getting caught up with sort of saying to have, oh, I should keep this or keep that. And another was, I think, as started with the front porch, was just celebrating the yellow. As you saw in that last image, she painted every room in the house yellow. Yellow is kind of a favorite color of hers. And then lastly, thinking about how the house could grow. So originally intended it to be a triplex, although zoning, very challenging, had all these limitations of why I couldn't do a triplex and would have had to go to committee. Not to say that it couldn't happen, but just it took longer in the process. So it ended up going with a basement unit that could be used in its current condition for a tenant or an in-law suite, or as my family kind of grows, taking that over that space. Or you see a small section of it now. The porch, and I think, was interesting. I've always been really interested in archives as a starting point, Toronto archives, and I think the work that we're doing, that's often an intriguing point for us in a lot of our work. But the porch needed to be rebuilt, so it was rebuilding kind of, we phrase it as kind of the former glory, with the pregnant balusters, and then giving it a bright splash of color. And also the place where my wife and I got married. And I think part of it was, challenging kind of a lot of contemporary architecture now, which is, very austere, removing porches. But, thinking of, a private home can have a public element or a public face to the street, or community. And planting an oak tree, which Ollie, great landscapers in the house, friend, helped us do. Thinking about a moment of kind of a generational tree, something that would outlive myself, kids, grandkids, and even potentially the house. And I think, thinking of a home that can gradually grow. And I think a lot of our work is, talking about kind of what is change and continuity in our city. And working with artists, which I think is another theme in our work. So if you don't know Rajni Pereira, a really amazing Toronto-based artist, doing great work. And I asked her to sort of paint a mural. I wanted to do a mural, but she advised me not to, just, over time, what if there's like damage or water damage and it wrecks it. So it's a painting on mylar that acts as a stained glass in the house, or in the void that was currently my grandmother's. The house is a lot messier now with kids, but essentially allowing for a space that was, somewhat removed from memories, the physical space. Another view. And a key thing, having lived in a basement apartment and hating the tiny little windows that you kind of get in the Toronto basement apartments, if anyone's familiar, was, providing space for whoever lives there or whoever uses that space, which is much natural light as possible. So pass it off to Shane.
I'll follow it up without grandparent stories, unfortunately. So the second part is looking at a changing city and understanding some of the affordability and cultural vibrancy impacts. So this is a diagram from the provincial government looking at the future planning of residence and employment spaces within the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and looking at, and we're showing it just to look at the future growth that is planned for the region. So 2051, the GTHA, Greater Toronto Hamilton area, has a projected population of 11 million, and then the outer ring, a total, including the outer ring, there's a total of almost 15 million. So significant amount of growth. And where does that growth go? How does the city respond to that growth? Is something that we're really interested in. So some more diagrams looking at changes in income and population, both within the city of Toronto and then through the wider regions. And one thing, so the different bars, so blue are high income census tracts, and then the white are middle income, and then the red are lower income. And that becomes very apparent when you look at how the city has changed over the last 50 years. So in the early 70s, there was a strong concentration of lower income communities in the core, with higher income communities north of Bloor, straight up through the center of the city up to the border of York region. And the rest of the city was mostly middle income. And then over time, there's been huge inversion in terms of where the population, how income is distributed. And you still have that core of intense wealth right in the heart of what is now the city of Toronto. But then further out, there's more lower income neighborhoods, and you also have more wealth in the core and areas like just east of like East York, this area here, which was working class neighborhoods, has changed significantly to a higher income neighborhood. And looking at that density and how the city grows, came across this diagram or this sketch from Jack Diamond and Barton Myers, looking at the initial growth of, this is St. Jamestown neighborhood. We are closer over here. And they pictured this doomsday scenario of growth, of what if the whole city was to be converted from low density housing to higher density, and identifying the doomsday, the fear that would go come around with that. And this was particularly looking at ways in which to prevent the demolition and the change in building types in Corktown, but was expanded to a wider scale. And if you look at it today, that area has not grown at all. So their doomsday scenario actually has restricted, or going against that doomsday scenario has actually created in housing affordability challenges, and the rest of the city closer to Yonge has grown significantly, but you still have this pocket of the core that is just a few blocks from here that is not increase in density at all and has lost density over the years.
Yeah, sure. Before getting into one little Jamaica project, I think taking it back to my grandmother. Well, so I think the key takeaway is, someone like my grandmother who didn't have more than a high school education, came to Canada as a single woman with 2 kids, was able to buy a house. That situation doesn't exist today. Definitely not in the core. Where, so just quickly jump back here. And I think this is a key takeaway. There's 2, is that, 51%, this is 2015 stats, so it could be worse, that, 51% of Toronto's population is low income. That's distressing. And just looking at the 905, we're virtually zero, at least according to this chart, where now it's, close to 30%, if not more. Again, this is 9 years old. So this doomsday scenario, in many regards, is coming out. And the doomsday scenario, calling it the doomsday scenario, maybe Jack and Barton Miles were wrong. And I think it's a fundamental question of growth in the city today. So what you see is the low dense area of Cabbagetown and Rosedale surrounding these neighborhoods, which are predominantly affluent and predominantly white. What does that mean when we talk about, culturally rich neighborhoods like Little Jamaica? So this project started, and it was in collaboration with Black Urbanism Toronto and Open Architecture Collaborative Canada, looking at, as a grassroots approach, looking at issues of displacement in Little Jamaica, and started with a mapping exercise. And this, you can't see the text there, but one's from 2010 to 2020, so just before COVID. A significant decrease in the number of Black-owned and Caribbean-owned businesses, which was further accelerated with COVID. And it's, stats to show that the Black population decreasing at a faster rate than the overall general population, and a lot of community concerns with the issue of, this wasn't being addressed. I think a lot of people talked of the Eglinton line and Metrolinx as this, great urban initiative, supporting transit and, transit-oriented density and communities and 15-minute cities and all the things I think us as urbanists talk about. But from a resident's perspective, construction to be decades old, more than a decade long of construction, and a lot of challenges that couldn't fully address as architects. And I think this is some of the challenges that we've sort of faced. It's things of, planning or other policy, or just simple things of debris on a street, or walkability for foot traffic. And being close to home, the focus again was some of the archival images of what Little Jamaica was. And I think a critical thing for us, and I think personal interest, was not to sort of try to be nostalgic about a community, understanding that cities change, but why they change and who has autonomy in that change. And it was, talking to, and this was led by Budo with our support, was, talking to business owners of, what were the issues and how we as architects could try to quantify them or qualify them in built form to a certain degree, which led to this, very speculative image of what Little Jamaica could be. And it was, largely focused on, beautification, tree planting, allowing some of the things that could happen. Or that happened to take a step back there, allowing things that already happened on the street and offering more opportunities, whether that's like food vendors, barbecuing, or turning a green pea parking lot into, a farmer's market or grocery store or public art facility. And continued that with, ideas on could we support, incremental densification. I think understanding the limit. So this image was from our exhibition in the Venice Biennale, which was a continuation of these similar ideas, and it was working with a community land trust. So, thinking of a group that's kind of limited budget, how would they start? They might start from, a small apartment or a basement suite, and thinking about how, a city could grow. And again, as sort of a speculative project, asking, a simple question of, if we allow laneway housing, then, why not laneway cafes or laundromats or bike repair shops or auto mechanics? Thinking, I think one of the key things was, if there's affordability, and we talk about affordable housing, a key component in culturally rich areas is, the economic component. So Little Jamaica, isn't Little Jamaica without the retail strip. And I think sometimes that gets lost in some of the conversations, or, if people have to move out of a neighborhood, they're no longer, say, living close to walk to their, local stores. So they're less likely, especially with all the construction, to go back to a neighborhood. And thinking, does a barber who doesn't rely on foot traffic, a business who's largely word of mouth based, do they need to pay Main Street retail prices and leases for that type of a business? And these were speculative questions. Another being, how are there opportunities, and some of these, challenge current zoning or building code. So that, this example here is, typically, our midline guidelines and things are changing with parking minimums don't allow us to build the way we used to build cities on these small lots. So, 20, 30 foot wide lot. And this is asking, and it's a lot of reasons. So parking minimums, which have recently changed, but, the size of garbage trucks, the need for 2 egress stairs, an elevator. So, typically a developer has to do all that from a pro forma perspective. It makes sense to, acquire a lot of lots, which, as we know, a lot of these new developments don't have the same fine grain retail that, we admire in the city, whether it's, the Annex, Kensington Market, Queen West, etc. So this is, imagining what could a building be if we built more incrementally, and not to say this is the only type, but to imagine if we changed zone or the building code zoning to allow for, say, single egress stairs. Currently on Eglinton at 4 stories, you need to step back without getting a minor variance. So I think asking these types of questions again, and apartments of varying scales in a community. So not so much pressure forced on these, sensitive retail streets and hubs. And an image, a sketch by a great illustrator, cartoonist, Giamma And this is in Venice, you know, imagining what a lane like Reggae Lane could be. And I think it's Reggae Lane, but it could be Chinatown. It could be Little Italy. It could be, you know, Church Wellesley Village. Of what could our laneways be? And a broad theme of, you know, saving the communities. I think we said save, but I think it's more just allowing communities to flourish. I think I would love to see new little Jamaicas occur in other parts of the city. There's a lot of pressure for, you know, neighborhoods like Kensington Market to, like, we need to protect it. But I think the counter to that is to allow more Kensington markets to occur, which currently zoning, we don't allow that. Am I doing this one? Yeah. Okay. What time are we at? Here. Yeah. Part 3, a changing city. So I think an extension to change, you know, culturally and displacement and affordability. I think there's a question of what is heritage. We'll read a quote. In Toronto, notions of heritage are mostly equated with Victorian homes and early 20th century neoclassical industrial buildings. But what about everything else? In particular, what about our modernist structures? And this map is really interesting. It's a City of Toronto map outlining the building construction dates. You can't read it here, but the yellow is essentially pre-1901. I can't even read it. And then kind of 1901 to 1915 and so forth.
And the green is 1940s and after.
Where you see the vast majority, at least from an area perspective of our city, was built after the Second World War. And I think we're not at a point yet where we consider much of that built form as heritage, whether it's sort of high-tech architecture, brutalist architecture, or sort of minimalist modern architecture. And we see that in projects like the St. Lawrence Center on Front Street. And originally, the plan was to demolish the building. And I see Alex here posed a question to us, and it was part of a Globe and Mail article of, you know, how can a contemporary arts institution, or can a contemporary arts institution reimagine itself without purging its past? And our vision was that, yes, you could. And it's, I think the key takeaways are here is that heritage can get mashed up with something new. I think there's this tendency for heritage to have to what's the word? Have to be very respected, or that what's new has to defer to what's existing. So with setbacks, or you can't see it. And I think, you know, this proposal was kind of trying to, how could something contemporary pick up on the language of what was there, but still be new at the same time? And I think another challenging thing, which we'll get to in the next project, is I think a lot of projects, whether Victorian, I think it was the same with, you know, people's approach to Victorian buildings in the 60s and 70s, was that over time, with a lot of additions, buildings become decrepit and the original architectural intent isn't always apparent. So I think it's sometimes distilling that back to what was there. And that was essentially this project, that you could modernize a space, you could make it accessible, you could rejuvenate the mechanical systems, washrooms, and create a new icon in the city. Alexandra Park, similar theme, and kind of the, I guess, kind of West End version of Regent Park, for those of you who aren't familiar. So talking about an 18-acre site between Dundas and Queen and just west of Spadina and Chinatown. Like so much of kind of post-war rejuvenation, saw the original fabric, like Regent Park, which was South Cabbagetown, demolished to make way for a new housing development. The architecture team led by Jerome Markson was in many ways against that, but, you know, was trying to, you know, have an incremental approach that didn't come to fruition, which was, you know, left to what it is today, which we'll get in the next image. And currently, construction since 2014, a new proposal, similar to a lot of redevelopment of social housing sites, was the introduction of market housing to support the rejuvenation of the affordable rent-to-geared housing. And I think our question, and this was part of an Azure article piece, if anyone's interested in reading more, was why tear it down? From the built form, I think architecturally speaking, culturally speaking, people's memory to a site, but also the embodied energy of landfilling buildings. We spend a lot of time lecturing people about plastic bags, straws. We're talking about concrete and brick, lots of embodied energy. Where does that go? Does that just go into the spit? But also the natural heritage. So trees that have taken 2 generations to grow. And the earlier map where Shane was showing income disparity, if you map the income disparity to our urban tree canopies, there is also a disparity as well. Again, I think these images are really beautiful and it's going to speak to the nature of it. And a beautiful thing about Alexander Park and the quotes in the exhibition, in many of the streets are very car light or just pedestrian friendly. All the things that we focus on today as urbanists, especially as kind of progressive urbanists. So it seemed shocking to sort of immediately come to a conclusion that we had to introduce like vehicular oriented streets like we do in the rest of the city. And this is interesting too. So this is Toronto Mayor Philip Givens in 1965 of the photo op demolishing, the existing housing of what became Alexander Park. And then Mayor Art Eggleton, 1990, knocking down a wall that was seen as, supporting delinquents and things like that. And I think architecture often gets blamed as problems for social ills and neglect from all levels of government, unfortunately. And a question I think we pose is, we've come to accept, these decrepit, dilapidated Victorian homes should be restored, but not so much for things like modernist architecture, which in many ways have fallen into disrepair. The landscaping is rough. They've added windows, clearly people don't have central air. It needs some TLC. And I think we were really interested in is why tear it down? There is architectural intent, there is architectural beauty. Could we keep, these buildings holistically for a community? And I think in the critique, we tried to put our money where our mouth is and said, what would we do if we could imagine Alex Park, where we kept most of the buildings? So the purple buildings there are, the existing buildings and townhomes, and new buildings, largely adding the density, assuming, that there would be market housing, which is a whole, I think, other conversation of we're doing new social housing developments without introducing new rent to geared income. So there's no more affordable housing than there was when it was first built, which is shocking when you think about how much Toronto has grown. And in many ways, a one-time trick from a public policy perspective of what happens when you need to rejuvenate Alex Park or Regent Park 50 years from now. And I think, using parking lots as a place for adding density and acknowledging that there were, issues with the design in terms of like views, access, introducing commercial and community spaces to a master plan where, largely keeping a lot of the buildings intact, adding density on the, largely periphery or where there was, open parking lot spaces. And I think a model that we don't approach in Toronto as a city, I think, part of Toronto's a fear of towers, kind of that doomsday scenario that you can have sort of towers next to smaller buildings. Where, and I think the Distillery District, which gets a lot of hate as a Disneyland perspective, in many ways it is. I think from a built form, it's interesting because it's largely, it says, let let the old buildings just be the old buildings. And if you're going to build something new next to it, and they can still function in the same way that they did. And I think what we're interested in is, heritage beyond appearance, but also heritage as use. That it's not necessarily just a facade. And not to say facadism is wrong, but I think being okay that there are other approaches to preserving built form, and speculative imagination of what Vinali Street, the pedestrian street, could be, with greenery and paving and towers beyond.
So the next part of the presentation is looking at public space. So the question is, what if we treat our public spaces with the same pride and comfort as we do our homes? So the first project that we're going to show is Fragments of a Home, which was an entry into design competition for the revitalization of two intersections underneath the Gardner, and it was sponsored by the Bentway. So our site that we were looking at was the intersection of Lakeshore and Simcoe Streets. And what we did, we looked at the history of the site, the history of the Gardner, especially on its western edge, in the manner that it demolished existing neighborhoods, and also looking at the broader context of residential uses within the city. And we explored how we could actually kind of deconstruct or abstract certain elements of residential space and provide that as amenities to the public space. So taking these kind of just follies of and typical elements from homes and reinterpreting them as follies. So here we have the whole 25 different elements, and then we went through and a process of selecting certain elements, certain follies for the site and placing them throughout the area. And it was a real attempt to animate the space with these individual elements, not to encompass the entire intersection, but the broader vision was to take these smaller follies and extend them from beneath the Gardner, from west to the east. So here are some representations of that, looking at some of the elements, the seating, light bulbs. This project is a another competition entry for design competition for a new park along King Street East, just south of here. And the park really had a focus in celebrating the history of the Black community that had been fairly prominent in the area from the 19th century through to today. And our approach was to take elements from the historical context, both of Toronto, but more broadly throughout the African diaspora, and really use that to infuse those elements into a singular narrative that in a fountain that really touched on many different reference points, and provided a space that also literally reflected the residents of the neighborhood. So some of the references are shown here. And as you go through, also showing our work on the exhibition design for the Magdalene Dundo's exhibition at the Gardner. So this was Magdalene Dundo, who's a famed ceramic artist based in the UK with a Kenyan heritage. She presented her work, which really explored ideas of form and materiality, and her work itself is very much informed by both Western European ceramic practices, as well as West African and East African ceramic practices, and she's melded them together to create very beautiful, very unique forms. And if you have the opportunity, go to the Gardner Museum. The show is on for another couple of months. So our work really involved interpreting Magdalene Dundo's sculptures and the idea of creating a sense of enclosure, of embodiment, and also the texture and the feel and the materiality of the objects and reinterpreting that into a space. So taking the space from this white cube into a textured context. Here's some images. And another example of a project or taking the historical context and really updating it and reinterpreting it through to today is a washroom pavilion in Hyde Park. So originally there were several shelter structures throughout Hyde Park. And several of them have been renovated through the years with additions featuring washrooms. So this is an elevation from the building department from the 1920s, where they designed these parks that were distributed throughout Hyde Park, but also through many parks throughout the city. And our interpretation of the project was to reference the later added cherry blossoms, but also the fact that there's a significant conservation element at the site, where a lot of the there are some groups that support the migration of turtles from Grand Air Pond through to a nesting site adjacent. So our work and this project was designed from a functional perspective to add washroom capacity, but also to create 4-season washrooms within the park. And we interpreted both the texture, the materiality, some references of the cherry blossoms, which is a very significant event annually in the park, as well as some of the other uses that occur, and reinterpreted that into a new space for a new washroom pavilion for the park. And now we come full circle to what will Granny's House be in the future?
All right. So yeah, what will Granny's House be? And I kind of mentioned that at the beginning of, I also think of like kids' generation. What are they going to do for housing in the future? Maybe they'll have to do like we wanted to actually do a Granny's House 2.0, but we ran out of time. It was kind of what was Granny's House in say 2050? Is it a 6-story building? Is it a tower? Or is it kids gonna sell it to developers for millions of dollars and like go south somewhere? But I think homes. So this is in saying full circle. So this is on Ontario Street. Black woman in front of Ontario House. This is the YWCA's Ontario House, which supported housing and boarding for Black women in Toronto at the early 20th century, which I guess you could imagine could use probably a lot of support. An interesting thing is, one, this is St. Jamestown. So this is where the doomsday scenario was sketched, but also, a house a house with pretty ornate. So probably a house for middle to upper middle class Torontonian at the time, turned into housing for Black women run through the YWCA. So I think this idea that our city has changed, and I think a lot of resistance has been, that it shouldn't change or what should or can't. But if you look back in history, homes have changed, and I think, we question that, especially in a lot of our work where, we're doing, single, family homes. This house in the East End in Leslieville, a really fun project, but I think is, interesting to kind of just ask the question, what could this house be if it wasn't a single family home? Could it be apartments? Could it be a laundromat or cafe? Based on those images that would really support, and just, this is a project in East York where we're doing an addition, again, a single family home. What could it be if it wasn't just a home? A really fun project, St. Clair, Witchwood Park area, an Eden Smith designed home that we're doing an addition to for an art collector and an artist. But again, sort of thinking, especially in a situation like this for an art collector, could this be more of a gallery, of a space? Could it have a cafe, a place for people to visit beyond just being a private residence? Which gets us into Band Gallery, which we'll quickly talk about. This is a band, an acronym for Black Artists Network and Dialogue, at the corner of Brock and Noble Street, so in Parkdale, just north of Queen. We worked on this project up until schematic design and zoning approvals. Was, imagining an art center and cultural center and gallery in what was formerly a home that's only 14 feet wide. Again, so some of the challenges, as mentioned before, so these strict requirements for 2 egress stairs for a relatively small building would just ate up a chunk of space. The big idea was I think we were really interested in celebrating the back, especially as a place for Black history. Historically, thinking the back entrance, the back of the bus, could the back be a place of celebration and a place to sort of admire? And also to, thinking, I think some of the questions of, heritage, does a Victorian need to be restored? So some of the challenges, with arts organizations where, huge portions of their budget that we have found, question whether that needs to, say, go into restoring a Victorian era building. Thinking of Diamond Schmidt, I think York Square, which has been demolished, is a really interesting example where it was allowed for something new, but didn't have to sort of defer or be totally reverent to what was once there. Again, earlier images which have, changed now. Again, gallery at the back, gallery space. What we found was doing a mezzanine allowed for only one exit, because in the code you're allowed, anything above 3 stories you need a second exit, but by having a mezzanine you could limit that to 1 story. Wild Seed on Cecil Street. So this is for the Wild Seed Center for Art and Activism, which we're currently working on phase 1, which is an interior renovation. Phase 2, this is a conceptual sketch, would be an addition to the back, including a black box theater for dance and performance and for additional cultural events. Similar thing too, that's, bigger than Granny's house, but it could be Granny's house. Granny's house could be a cultural center. And Wild Seed was formerly a house of an on-site image of the progress to date. Whoops, sort of fast forwarding here. An elevation, and I think, specifically, I think tying it to an end. So Wild Seed, so maybe Shane, you might want to speak to this one. Yeah, this was your slide.
So, this image on the right is inside of the Donavalon Center. So there was an activist, Donald Moore, in the 1940s and 50s, who was very active in petitioning the Canadian government to allow immigration from the Caribbean. At the time, there was really no path from the early 20s until 1955. There was almost no path for anyone to immigrate from the Caribbean or from most majority Black countries into Canada. And Donald Moore created this organization that work with the Canadian government and the colonial governments in Jamaica and Barbados at the time that allowed a significant number of domestic workers to come, and only female domestic workers to come to Canada. And part of the context here is that this streetscape, this is a street elevation, and the Wild Seed Center is here, and the Don Avalon Center was here. And so we've actually just mashed together some of the future images of the entrance with the historical context. And we found a lot of just contextual references of the area, looking at the legacies of Black community organizations, cultural organizations, activist organizations in the area. But also, just to bring it full circle, is Tura's grandmother came in
65 and was a domestic worker. She first went to which I found interesting, didn't know this until kind of digging through, cleaning up her house, was she first lived in a house in Dunvegan Road, so in Forest Hill. And I think that is it. And I think before we close, I think just want to say, didn't do a shout out to all the people who've made SOCA possible beyond Shane and myself. Danny, who works with us, is here. Kelly, where are you? Works with us, is here.
Yahweh actually worked.
Morgan Staples, Maya, Arslin, Alexander, Gigi.
Yeah.
So in the past 5 years, we've had an amazing team that, has helped supported, exploring these ideas further. Thank you.
Get someone who, get a student volunteer who's supposed to take the microphone, or, okay, so it's not me, good. All right, so, question. Don't all speak at once.
Crickets.
Hello. This is less of a question, but more of a. I just want to say thank you so much for presenting this. I really enjoyed this presentation. I really enjoy the fact that you brought up, especially in the Little Jamaica section, how we can possibly densify without just destroying, or I thought that the message was like really powerful. Thank you so much. Just in general for the entire presentation.
Thank you so much, Shane and Tura. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about your representational strategies to show the projects. You mentioned the importance of the archive, and you're also obviously bringing in personal recollections, historic photographs, but there's also a kind of inventiveness and joy in the rendering. So maybe just how the representational strategies advance the work.
Yeah, I think on most projects, we really try to uncover, historical references for the site, but that also may, we may also encounter artwork and other references in terms of, pictorial representations of the buildings, but also pictorial representations of different works of art over time. So we always try to push ourselves and push our team to create work that I think challenges assumptions in terms of how architecture may typically be represented, and using sources outside of architecture for representation. And Karen mentioned that project in Little Jamaica, the rendering by an illustrator, Gemma Gariba. And for that project, it was really important to capture the essence of the site without actually representing any particular architecture. We wanted to represent the sense of the architecture, sense of space, but not in a way that was too prescriptive in terms of its its mode of representation.
Cool. I also wanted to say thank you as well. I can tell in your projects that there's a good deal of care, simply for the fact that people have existed, the fact that they exist now, and also like a great amount of future vision for the fact that even though we don't know these people, they will exist at some point. So that is refreshing and lovely, and thank you. But I want to ask you if you see this vision of sort of allowing these like Kensington Market identified culturally specific places, if you see this being applied in like the suburbs of Toronto, you know, like a Jane and Weston like situation, like sort of that thing going on. Because when we talk about contemporary, like I'm also thinking about things built in like the 80s, like how do we speak to neighborhoods like that?
So yeah, a really good question. And the short answer is yes. And since it's a theme, bring in my grandmother. So if my grandmother was coming to Canada today, she wouldn't be moving into what's kind of now commonly called Leslieville. She would be moving to the periphery of Toronto, if not the 905, so Mississauga or Brampton. And I think, you know, thinking of a place like Kensington Market or Little Jamaica, you know, they didn't happen by someone saying, let's make this Little Jamaica. In a lot of ways, it kind of goes back to that map of people, middle-class people moving to the suburbs and opportunities for Jamaicans, Chinese, Italians, Portuguese to make these neighborhoods what they are today. So I think to say, I said before, is like allowing for new Little Jamaicas to occur, and it could be new Chinatowns or what have you. And I think a big part of that is zoning. You know, another thing is the economics. So people in Kensington, as a Jewish market, which sort of turned into the market, which my grandmother till her death always called Jewtown, and would just refer to it as that. Sort of started as a market, really at a necessity, as an opportunity to support themselves. And I think understanding, you know, the market in much of our city doesn't allow that, but I actually think in less expensive areas, so thinking in the periphery or thinking in Brampton, it's more likely to happen, at least not sort of as purely a labor of love. I think that being said, it also is already happening. I think a good way, you know, some students in our fourth year class right now are looking at just mapping these locations, and, you know, there might not be a sign, but if you look on Google Maps, you know, you'll see that, you know, someone's operating a business in their house, to varying degrees of what that business is. So yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, you shared a lot of projects where you had a very personal connection to the site or to the project. And so I'm asking this question a little bit because in the master's studio that Joey and I are currently teaching, we ask the students to pick a site that they have a personal connection to. And so it's lovely to see your approach with sites that you have a personal connection to. And I guess, is there a difference in terms of the way you approach a project that you can find that link with versus a project that you don't have that with? In terms of your process, how does that affect how you approach it?
Oh, good one. You want to go? Yeah, let's start, and I'll come in.
So I think a site itself may have an immediate personal connection in terms of the physical locality, but even the programming, the way that people even interact in the space, even if it's not a specific program, there's always some element of your personal story or personal narrative that you can bring to the project. So it's not, even if it's not on that site, you have that inspiration, that connection that you can always tap into, and your perspective, everyone's perspective is going to be unique in its own way, and that will allow the project to be richer when you actually are able to explore what the particularities of a site are in reference to your personal story.
I'll add to that. So I think, yeah, I would say even in some of the personal stories, there's always something new. So Granny's house was a bit of a self-discovery of this woman who I didn't know as a younger woman. You know, Little Jamaica's on the screen. It's called Little Jamaica. Jamaicans love to be known. But you know, it's really a diverse community, and not just even a diverse Black community. It's like West Indians and, you know, people who are from the Caribbean. I mean, to think of colonialism are really from all corners of the earth. There's a large Filipino community. I think some of the challenges too is, you know, might be, you know, Jamaican, West Indian businesses, but then, you know, they're owned by a Portuguese family. So it's very diverse. And I think these questions, you know, we approach, and, you know, sometimes maybe from outside communities, and not saying that's what your question is getting at, but like, you know, even when we're in our community, we're also dealing with, you know, elements that aren't part of our community. So it's new to a degree. And I think, you know, thinking of Wild Seed or Band, and, you know, or even, you know, specifically like those organizations where it's like questions of the diaspora, and that's not obviously a monolith, it's something huge. So it's, you know, taking things, asking questions, being critical even in our own assumptions.
Yeah, and yeah, I think to add to that, there are a lot of Black community organizations that we've worked with in the past, and it's really important, I think, for us to state that all of the organizations are very different from one another in terms of their community, their outlook, because it's not a monolith. So, for example, Wild Seed has a very particular focus on disability justice, environmental justice, and LGBTQ rights. So the way that we approach that is going to be slightly different from even small scale retail on Reggae Lane. So it's bringing something, but you're not going to have that full, you still have to find the ways in which you connect with the project and with the clients, and it's not going to be a full match ever.
Just to reiterate, the fantastic presentation. One of the points I think is great to speak more to is the critical practice dimension. And I love the idea that you did these months to, you know, witnessing that there's something inadequate that's happening in the sort of accepted normal way that the city is developing, you know. So the contrary proposal is really great. And it reminded me of Michael Sorkin when there was the big competition for the Helsinki Guggenheim Museum in Finland. And a lot of people didn't like the way it was being set up. And they actually introduced a whole different competition, which was the next Helsinki. And they got all of this feedback, you know, and input, and then published a book about it with that critical practice. But I just, maybe if you just speak about how, as architects, you know, you found a way to engage critically and to do these really exciting proposals that I hope people will learn about.
Yeah. So that's, yeah, lots of good questions here. So I think that's really good. I think one has been, I think with a lot of people, is like a frustration of, you're kind of trained to be this like critical, big idea thinker in school, and like, yeah, I'm going to change the world. And you get out and you're doing Doris schedules on some like crappy condo tower, and you're kind of just whacking your head against the desk. So I think there's a part of that, that's, as I mentioned, kind of the naming of Studio of Contemporary Architecture as a studio that was intrigued and responded to the contemporary conditions. So I think to a degree you have to be critical. Challenge has been, a lot of the speculative work has been, it's unpaid. And even the competitions, they're like, they're not really, they're like small honorariums. But it's, I think, a core to what we wanted. And I think to a degree, which we didn't mention, this has been successful in a lot of ways, or how you kind of, it changed the conversation. So St. Lawrence Center, for example, the article that came out in the Globe and Mail, led to the RFP brief changing to incorporate portions of the facade. And to a degree, I actually, in a way, disagreed with that, in the sense like it's almost took the proposal and sort of said like, yes, we have to keep it. Well, I actually think there could be a version where you tear down the St. Lawrence Center and it's potentially better than what we proposed, but it was more asking the question. And I think part of architecture too is, why we explore these things is architecture is so litigious, that people don't want to explore different options. So it's kind of what we do. A Little Jamaica, for example, at first the city said it's not a heritage district, it's not worth keeping, which to a degree you get. But, if you ask the question, there's nothing particularly beautiful about the buildings in Little Jamaica. And I think this is about questions of heritage, from appearance to heritage of use. And you could pose the same question with, Kensington Market, for example, a great neighborhood, iconic Toronto neighborhood. But if you actually look at the buildings, they're kind of crappy, poorly built buildings. There might be one or two, you sort of see nice Victorian brick fronts. Maybe they've been kept, maybe not, but nothing particularly, special. It's kind of how it functions. But did change the conversation where the city looked at, making it a heritage district, which also has its limits. I think the point is not to make something like a museum, a Disneyland. And I think something that people might not want to hear is, maybe Little Jamaica doesn't exist in the future, but it might exist elsewhere in other neighborhoods. But if it doesn't exist, it sort of happens on its own terms. And I think, using kind of the comparison to Kensington Market, I think is interesting as a predominantly, a suburb turned kind of Jewish suburb turned Jewish market. The Jewish community, gradually moved out of Kensington Market. There wasn't, a creation of a city hall to displace people, or a transit line. And I think there's that autonomy that's missing in a lot of these conversations, especially with Kensington Market. But I think, I think the big thing is it's fun too. And it can push ideas beyond, questions, client briefs. Challenges in emerging practice is there aren't really the same types of competitions that we have here. I mentioned I graduated in the Netherlands. I have, a fair amount of colleagues who've started practices. There seems to be much more of a support system for taking risk, but also competitions here. If you want to design a library, you'll read a brief and they'll say like, have you designed 5 libraries between 10 and 25 million in the last 5 years? And you're kind of going, no. So it's a way to explore things beyond single family homes too. And I think the big thing is having fun, kind of keeping the drive and enthusiasm of being in school alive.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very insightful. The project I found kind of most maybe relatable or applicable to me was the band house, and I was very intrigued in how one could both have living space and workspace in the same building envelope. And I'm just wondering what steps towards policymaking and sort of application could we take towards making this sort of like a real thing, like this sort of mixed use residential mass application. For instance, if you go to sort of East Eglinton and all these areas with a lot of small bungalow houses, as opposed to one just having money and coming and buying and building a house, how could we sort of enforce the policy making towards letting these generational homes build their own sort of future, their own land for their families, and sort of developing those neighborhoods in that aspect?
Good question. I think really grassroots. So a lot of it is, is policy. I would say the YIMBY movement, if those are familiar, kind of the yes in my backyard of more options. I think I'd say an unfortunate part of it is it's largely focused on density, but I think because largely the pushback is on density, but really it's about conversations of, I think our interest is really ultimately culture and, built form, and density supports the culture in our cities. So I think it's people being active and, gradual change of like-minded people gradually having more positions of power in architecture, academia, and policymaking at the city.
I wanted to start off with wonderful presentation. Thanks. Wonderful presentation. Within your lecture, you discussed like these two sort of extreme types of like housing. You have like these these two visions, I guess, of like what different like density housings can like lead to. Like you have the doomsday idea of like these like large swaths of like high density housing, and then you have like the current, you showed like images of the current state of Toronto wherein there's an excess of like sort of single family housing, and how that's sort of like contributed to like the housing crisis. Recently within the city of Toronto, they implemented, well, at least I heard they implemented some policies and whatnot that would allow for the developments of more mid-rise housing projects. And I wanted to ask if, like, how do you believe that will impact your work as a practice, especially with the large focus on like cultural preservation and expression?
I think one thing with the doomsday scenario, it's not, high density is not, I don't think we're of the opinion high density is bad. I think it was more from the 1970s, the vision of that type of density was viewed as a negative, but if done well, high density is needed. There's an incredible amount of population that the region needs to accommodate, and it needs to be accommodated in the core. It's best accommodated in the core. And not to say that there is not a space for medium density as well. There's significant opportunity for our neighborhoods to increase significantly in density areas. Like we were talking about the Danforth earlier, between the Don Valley and Pape, that area has declined in population over the last 50 years, where certain areas of the city have increased many times. So it's about increasing density throughout the city, but a significant amount of density needs to be added to actually accommodate the growth and to reduce demand as well.
Yeah, one of the questions on the wall there, I think what you're getting at is kind of the missing middle, which is great, but also I think what we've been talking about is just thinking beyond the missing middle, especially in the downtown core and the limits of it. So one of the questions on the wall is, why are there single family homes 2 blocks from University Avenue? Which, when you think of like Toronto, the largest city in the country, a GDP equivalent to all of Alberta and all the oil sands they have there, or and you think about that, and you think of our downtown core has some dilapidated garages, a single family home. Is that the most appropriate use of land? And it's, yeah, I think it's a question, and I think as a city we haven't really answered it yet. I think a lot of people are advocating for different forms. And you're seeing, as you mentioned, kind of multiplexes. Those have their own limitations too. They're still, I think, deferring to Toronto as a house city and not as an urban city. That's kind of for future questions and exploration. Yeah. Good job.
So on behalf of the student body, faculty, and staff community of the Department of Architectural Science, we would like to thank you. Thank you for just sharing a glimpse into how Toronto is and will change through personal small scale examples like Granny's house, and as well as large and public scale like Little Jamaica, and just how they break down a complex and hard to grasp idea of Toronto as a changing city. And I just particularly loved how like you challenge the idea of what is heritage and what should be considered as heritage, and that the idea of preserving heritage goes beyond just preserving the appearance, but just digging deeper into how to show the heritage in like full display and like in in the intent of like the building. So thank you once again for sharing the works of SoCal with us.
Great. Thank you very much again. So I just have a few housekeeping things that I'll probably speak too quickly through. Thank you very much. It was an amazing lecture and really great. I now know your grandmother very well, which is, I think, something that you knew, and now we all get to share. So thanks for that. If we take nothing else away, that's something. So thank you very much to the Department of Architectural Science staff, especially Bridget Dalima, Aline Sereno, Alex Bersenau, our two technicians, Ivan and Leo, who, if they weren't here, we probably would not be able to deal with all this technology. So thank you to them. And also, again, thanks to the amazing student committee and for their enthusiasm planning today's lecture. So as I said, this was the first lecture of this term. The next lecture is like almost tomorrow. It's like February 8th. It's literally next week. So please make sure it's in your calendar, and it continues this idea of, you know, what cities can be. I think it's amazing that Toronto, we're at this point where we're actually asking these questions, and they're really important. And hopefully we get some answers. Next week, it's Nama Blonder of Smart Density. If you're doing anything related to housing in your studios, you should probably check it out. It's a must-see lecture. Just one point, it's co-hosted by the School of Urban and Regional Planning, which means it's not going to be here. So if you come here and you don't see anybody, it's because it's in South Bond building, room 312. So, I mean, I don't know if that's very helpful, if you know where room 312 is or not. Please check the website, and I'm sure you'll find it, and please attend that. It's bound to be something that you'll take a lot from. So thank you again for this evening, and thanks for sharing your time with us.